turn the microphone over to our panel on medical device plastics and our panel moderator, Michael Poloyan.
Thank you, Lori. First of all, I want to thank all of you for sitting in on this very interesting discussion pertaining to the selection of the optimum plastic material for medical devices. There are hundreds of thousands of plastics to choose from, and the purpose of this panel discussion is not to necessarily lead you to choosing a particular plastic, but to sort of encourage you to think of all the considerations that have to be taken into account when you're selecting a plastic. And at the end of the panel discussion, we'll invite a number of questions from the audience. The first part of this panel discussion will essentially consist of an introduction to this prestigious group of panelists. These are all experts in polymer materials, the leading industry experts. And then we'll get into a brief overview of material selection and the parameters for selecting plastics. And then we'll get right into the panel discussion, which will essentially comprise the majority of the time. I'm going to first introduce each panelist, and then from SABIC, Kenneth Breeding from Eastman, and Lawrence Acquarulo from Foster Compounding. So the first person I'd like to have introduce himself is Ed Flaherty.
Good morning. I'm Ed Flaherty. I'm the application development engineer for the New England area for Nexio Solutions. And I work in the healthcare medical arena and helping to design and work with people on picking materials.
Hello, I'm Larry Acquarulo, CEO, Foster Corporation, Putnam, Connecticut. We make plastic compounds for minimally invasive surgical devices and implantable devices.
I'm Ken Breeding. I'm a new business development associate with Eastman. I work with the eastern half of the United States, calling on medical device companies to help drive specifications with materials.
Good afternoon, I'm Lauren Bobrick. I'm a business development leader with SABIC Specialties Business, and I work with medical device OEMs on material specification.
And my name is Michael Poloyan. I'm your moderator, and I'm with Integrated Design Systems. We're a product development company here in New York, out in Oyster Bay, New York. And what we are always challenged with as designers and engineers are identifying the key design parameters for selecting a product. And of course, the one that you omit is usually the one that haunts you later on. And these parameters typically include the physical properties, the environments of use, the processing considerations, tool design, cost, availability, regulatory compliance, and of course secondary operations, all of which affect material selection. In addition to that, you have, in terms of physical properties, you've got tensile strength, impact strength, heat distortion temperature, friction, wear resistance, chemical resistance, UV resistance, and sometimes even surface hardness and scratch resistance. In addition to that, you've got clarity or ease of color matching. Some materials can't be color matched that easily. You've got density, flammability rating, coefficient of thermal expansion, surface gloss, long-term creep properties, fatigue resistance, electrical properties, including dielectric strength, dielectric constant. So all these parameters will affect your material selection. Some of them, of course, are more important than others, depending on what application you're involved in. And narrowing down the hundreds of thousands of plastics to a handful of viable materials is a critical decision you're making in your design and development. And I want to ask the panelists, my first question to them is, how does a designer or engineer narrow this list of hundreds of thousands of plastics down to a few options? What considerations should be taken into account? I'm going to start off with Ed Flaherty. Ed, if you don't mind.
That is the most difficult thing for a designer to do. As Mike just mentioned, we're trying to funnel down the variety of materials that we can pick from. And there's about 70 types of plastic, of which when you add something to it or combine two different types of plastic together or more, then you can get up to 800 80,000 grades of plastic. So you're starting off with 80,000 grades of material, and you need to find one that's going to work for your application. So that is the biggest challenge we're all starting with. And I like to use the logic that we're going to ask 100 questions. And what I mean by that is my job is to go in and talk with the designer and try and make sure that we've covered all of the bases. Mike threw up a number of different statements that you might be looking at. But even if you look at one, say the chemical resistance of the material, there are thousands of chemicals that might affect the plastic. So we have to define which ones are going to be used in the application, and then make sure that the plastic that we're going to pick is going to be resistant to that material. And you can do the same thing for every one of the other attributes that we looked at just a few seconds ago.
Yeah.
Larry?
That's exactly what Ed said. And I know Lauren, Ken, Ed, myself, for many years we've all been trained to listen to engineers and quality folks and designers. And as Ed mentioned, you ask a bunch of questions because we're trying to understand what the requirements are so we can help make some recommendations. Boiling it down really simply sometimes is to go back and look to see what the part or the design had been made out of previously, and you may want to stick with that exact same resin or add some other features to that resin.
I agree. I think, you know, in the presence of a customer or an engineer, you're trying to understand, they'll tell you what they want, but you have to dig deeper into that questioning to understand what they really are looking for. It's beyond just the mechanical strength of a plastic. It's going to be other things that this plastic may be exposed to in its use in the device. So I think you have to kind of dig through discovery, understanding what they're looking for, and then you can guide them on to what you may have in your portfolio of product.
Lauren?
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think when it comes to selecting a material for a medical device application, it really helps to have as much information upfront on not only the environment and the parts used, but how will it be assembled, what's the processing going to look like, you know, will biocompatibility be a requirement, all of that, and you know, what other materials is it going to come into contact with within the assembly, and all of that information is really going to help serve as a roadmap to narrow down, you know, many materials to just a few candidates for your evaluation.
I have a question for the panels. It's a general question. When a designer, now some of you are representing a specific resin company. So do you maintain an objectivity in advising a designer to choosing the right plastic, or do you sort of, you know, try to push your own resin? I know you're trying to do that anyway, but I mean, would you recommend your resin when it's not necessarily the ideal resin for the application?
Quite simply, I walk in with an open mind, and I want the designer to have the same open mind. When I walk in and somebody says, I want the cheapest plastic I can get for the application, we're already starting on the wrong foot. What you really need to do is meet the application requirements we just talked about. And then when you find out what those application requirements are, you find the plastic that meets the requirements with the least expensive cost to it. So we're, again, trying to be competitive, but you have to meet the requirements of the product.
Well, we don't make any resins, so we'll blend them. So we're trying to be as unbiased as possible. We're trying to understand what the application is and recommend some materials. I hear what Ed is saying. You know, everybody is interested in cost. If you could, try and look for the least expensive option. Sometimes that may not be your best option, but cost is always a factor. And we know that. We deal with this all the time.
I guess from the bias side of this question, being on the material supplier side, I try to do the same thing with an open mind going in to find out certainly if the materials that the company I work for is manufactured will meet the requirements. But if I find out very quickly in the discussion that, you know, whether it's a certain kind of physical property or downstage use in the device that I know their product cannot pass, then there's no reason for me to push a plastic on. Historically, these are the types of materials that you should look at, and that may fall into another supplier's. I mean, that's, to me, that would be, if I'm doing my job correctly. Certainly, I'm representing the company I work for, but at the same time, to help that designer is to make sure that if I know I don't have that product, would be to steer them to the type of materials that I know that can meet these requirements, and that's sort of the way it should be.
Yep, I think Ken brought up a good point of if I'm doing my job correctly, we look at all the information that we have available and try to select the right material for the application and try to be as resin agnostic as possible.
And these questions are, by the way, questions that I've asked over the years, and they're coming to mind as I'm actually engaging with them. None of this is rehearsed. It's all actually a real-life type of engagement. And another question I have is in terms of the questions and answers that are shared between yourselves and a prospective client or designer. Sometimes designers don't know what to ask. Sometimes the questions have to be sort of extracted because they might omit, they might not be aware of chemical resistance, they might not even know what to ask. So how does that kind of exchange, evolve or develop? I think Lauren wants to answer that one. Go ahead.
Sure. From my perspective, with Sabic, we have a resin application checklist, basically, which goes through all of the parameters that an application could be exposed to, whether it's mechanical loads, aesthetics, biocompatibility requirements, temperature, the duration, exposure, sterilization, all of that. It's a few pages long, so it's pretty extensive, and it covers all of those topics to help, again, provide as much information upfront as possible to narrow down that selection.
Same for Eastman. Basically, what we do is, we would look at what types of drugs or disinfectants that might be used on the device. And we, like a lot of the technical engineering companies, you typically want to bring the drugs in or the disinfectant chemicals in and to test in a standardized protocol. And we'll spend a lot of time focusing on that and developing data that we keep in a database, and it's there to share on an as-needed basis. And same thing, what she's referring to is they keep a checklist of materials. So it may be the sterilization method they're using, maybe how it's being assembled. And also, like I mentioned, chemicals or drugs that they're going to be exposed to. I mean, what's the life of this product? Is it a single-use disposable product, or is it something that's supposed to be in a hospital environment for 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I think a checklist is really the way to go, and I think probably all of our companies have checklists, and as much information on the use and life of that product, and that makes for a good recommendation.
Now, this group of people, I don't know how many, as a show of hands, how many have actually interacted with resin suppliers or material experts in selecting plastic material? Quite a few. Okay. How does one actually identify someone like yourself? I mean, I happen to know a lot of you, but how does someone that's unfamiliar with the resin industry actually reach out to an expert like yourselves? Who do they call without getting a series of numbers and digits to punch before they get disconnected?
Many times, I do have to mention, we supply about 9,000 grades of material worldwide. So we do have a little bit different scenario than a specific resin supplier. But we do get a lot of phone calls, and they're based on one material. And by the time I've gone in and talked to them about all of the other criteria that they're looking at, we may change materials. It may change, and I might actually say if it did require a silicon application, silicon material, I might be turning that over to somebody else. I might just say, this is a great opportunity for you to go to talk to this person, or a thermoset material. It may be a better application in this particular situation where the person has brought certain criteria that I can't meet with a thermoplastic material. Where do you find the person for that? I think you just have to develop like Mike has, a list of key contacts that you can bounce those questions off of. And once you have that, if you have good engineers that you're talking to, they'll bring you to other individuals if needed.
I know I'm showing my age. I thought I was 6 years older than I really am. But trade shows just like this, I know we've been exhibiting at trade shows like this, East, West, Europe. So there's some of us that are in the booth year after year after year. So you can come in and look us up in the directory and stop by the booth. And also today with the websites, you can get on the website and try and find the different companies like ourselves, Google AdWords and that sort of thing. You can Google it and hopefully you can get directed. And as Ed suggested, you keep a little database of people that you call and help you out, and just try and get the trail of the person in those companies, whether it be Eastman or Sabic or Nexio or whoever, somebody that could help you, and that's your go-to person for a while.
I'd like to now move on to the next question, which pertains to chemical resistance. And the question is, how does the designer identify a plastic which is resistant to these extremely harsh disinfectants that are used today? Maybe I'll start with Lauren on the end.
So we see chemical resistance as a need in medical device applications pretty frequently, especially for applications like housings that historically materials like PCBS were a great material for housings, and it no longer withstands the harsh chemical environment of the disinfectants used. So when it comes to these types of applications, it's important to define what the chemicals are that the part will be exposed to, how frequently the part will be cleaned, what the duration and exposure will be, and what is your factor of safety on that for the number of cleaning cycles. So from a material supplier perspective, we provide data, ESCR and environmental stress crack resistance data for many of our materials against various hospital disinfectants. It's quite common that somebody will come to us with a list of 70 of these disinfectants, and maybe we don't have all of the chemicals, but it really helps serve as a starting point to narrow down to the materials that would provide good chemical resistance that are good candidates to start with for your evaluation. And going back to the material supplier collaborations, I think it's important to engage with your material suppliers for applications like this, because we may be developing new materials to address some of these trends.
I agree, 100%. I think part of this is understanding what's going on, is when, understanding beyond the chemicals. How do hospitals make decisions around the disinfectants they're using and why? They're there to control a certain kind of bacterial infection in a certain part of the hospital. So then you go back and study, of course, as she said, the chemicals that are actually in these disinfectants and how your plastic stands up to these disinfectants. I think if you go to most of the material suppliers, you will find they have a list of plastics exposed that they own or sell that they have exposed to various different types of chemicals. For decades, it was just isopropyl alcohol was the primary disinfectant, going back many generations. But it's changed more when Medicaid, Medicare payment plans started affecting hospital repayment with infection control. So that changed. That's when a whole new series of disinfectants started coming out in the industry. Most of those are now bleach or ammonia or quaternary ammonias and other things added to the alcohols that were commonly used. So they have become more aggressive to a lot of plastics. And I think that's where you have to just go and just do the work. Spend some time in Google and YouTube and go to get information. And trade shows like this is a good example of that as well.
Exactly. The resin suppliers are doing a much better job of testing their materials against different types of cleaners, chemicals that the material might come in contact with. So you can look to their database. Also, at technical conferences, I know Society of Plastics Engineers, ANTEC, usually there's a couple of technical papers discussing chemical resistance of plastics for the medical device. So just looking at some of those white papers, a lot of information is out there. If you had any concerns, dial one of us up. A lot of it comes from experience, knowing that this material had been used in that environment for many, many years successfully. But you can really lean on the resin suppliers.
I'd like to add one more thing. I agree with everything that's said here. But one of the things that people don't recognize is you take the chemical test data that you receive based on ASTM test bars generally. The results are there. You can use that as a good gauge or a start. But the other thing that I think is extremely important is the final assembly may have some other things in it. Say it has press fit inserts, or it has thread cutting screws in it, or there's a secondary operation that may have an insert in it that might have some cutting oils on it. You have to really, after everything is done, you have to test your part in the actual environment that it's in to verify that it's going to be successful with the chemicals then that you're going to expose it to. They say a press fit insert in a boss, that's going to add hoop stress to the part, and the chemicals may attack that more than they did on the test bars that were tested already.
Ed brought up a great point regarding stress, and if I'm not wrong, I believe stress, temperature, and time are the three major parameters that will affect the environmental stress cracking. And one of the challenges that designers and engineers face is they don't want to spend $500,000 on molds only to find out that, based on a certain shrinkage for a material, only to find out that it's not appropriate. So how do you deal with that dilemma or that paradox?
For years now, people they go out and get a material block, machine it up, and test it out. That's a good indication. A lot of times it doesn't have the molded in stress that you would in your final product, but it's going to give you probably the closest approximation to the final product that you're going to get. Certainly going in and getting an SLA or a part made today with similar materials might be another option. But the last part of it is to simply take an area that you're going to say the hoop stress situation. You might even get a flat block of material and add the application requirements to that block. Thread cutting screws, press fit inserts, and do the tests on those as well. Your final product, again, is going to be your responsibility, but use all of the information you can to narrow down the spec.
I was going to make one little quick comment. Typically, when you're looking at stress in plastics, there are two types that typically are common. One is the applied stress of the application itself, where you're assembling, as he mentioned, screw bosses, snap fits, things like that. But there might be some residual stress from the molded plastic parts. And those two add up. It's not just like you have a molded part that has a certain amount of stress in it. You know, you can relieve that stress. There's ways of doing that. But if you add that stress on top of the applied stress, it adds to a much higher strain level. That's where environmental stress crack typically occurs from, based on the strain load and the chemical agent and the conditions like temperature or time.
Did you want to add one more thing, Larry? Go ahead.
It might have been at Eastman. I've seen where you had the test where you took flex bars and you put the sample under stress, and you had a whole bunch of solvents and chemicals and so forth, and you developed a lot of data, you know, based on the stress of the flex bars.
Well, the one thing everybody does this. You have the standard ASTM test where you look at a flex or tensile bar, and you're exposing it at a certain fixed strain level, and you're exposing it to certain chemicals. The one thing that we've been trying to do is understand what happens to the mechanical strength of that plastic. You know that when you mold it, it's got a tensile strength of this or an impact of this. A lot of designers look at that data when they make a decision. If you understand the chemicals that you're exposing it to, if you know after that exposure you still maintain a lot of that mechanical strength, that normally tells you've got a plastics that's designed for that opportunity. But that's not always the case. But I'm just trying to say that we call it the fourth step test. You can Google it, But that just means we're taking, instead of just looking for a physical environmental stress crack, grazing, things like that, measure the mechanical strength of that piece of material, and that will give you a different piece of the data that you're looking for that you don't always see.
I think it's important to remember too with that ASTM standard that there's a lot of variables that can be altered within that test. So whether it's temperature, time, exposure, and even the compatibility rating of measuring the mechanical performance. So we may define compatibility, based on a certain percentage of mechanical properties different than some other material suppliers. So, when you're looking at that data to make your resin selections, I would just be cognizant of making sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to the next consideration in many medical devices, and that's autoclaving. And I personally have had experience specifying plastics with published autoclaving data that didn't really match up to the real-life conditions. So my question to the panelists is, how does a designer or an engineer identify a plastic that'll repeatedly withstand autoclaving? What considerations should be taken into account? Go ahead, Ken.
Well, first and foremost, there's a smaller number of materials that can really truly be exposed to autoclave. There are crystalline materials that have a higher crystalline melting point that can certainly stand up to these higher temperatures. In the amorphous plastics arena, it's going to be based on the thermal glass transition temperature. We call it TG. And typically you're going to have to be something well above around 150 centigrade or higher to be exposed to the two types of autoclave, which are typically 135C and 121C. And that limits the number of materials you can look at.
Any other comments? Lauren?
Sure. Similar to chemical resistance, we provide data again of, say 2,500 autoclave cycles at 134C. So, similar to chemical resistance, I think it's important to understand what the parameters are going to be, how many cycles does the part need to withstand, what that factor of safety is again, and use that data to help guide your resin selection. But again, it's important to consider the entire environment as the part may fail due to environmental stress cracking conditions. So I'll give you a quick example. A customer had come to us with a large metal insert, and they selected a material that is suitable for repeated autoclave cycles, but due to the CTE differences between the metal insert and the plastic and some stress concentrations in the design, they were getting failure cracking in the same spot every time. So again, it's important to keep in mind what are the other variables that are going to come into contact with that part in the application, as it's not just selecting a material that's suitable for autoclave.
Go ahead.
And again, if cost is no object, there are some materials. Usually if there's a product off the shelf, a standard grade of materials that is not suitable for one reason or another, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to add something to the polymer to do something, but typically a compounder adds things to the polymer, a formulation of some sort. But also a compounder can take things out, like gels, like impurities, like volatiles. So that's something that a compounder does. Or it could change the particle shape of the polymer. Maybe the pellets are too big if you're going into a micro extruder or a micro molder, so you have to reduce the pellet size either through a melt processing or a grinding process. Those are all things that compounders do. But as Michael alluded to, usually 90% of what we do is we're adding something to the resin to give it some special feature, whether it's color, whether it's lubricity, stabilizers, radiopacity if it's going inside the body. So some of the things to specify, of course, you want to have formulation integrity, and the way you specify the ingredients, and if we've all worked in the medical device, some of these ingredients are hard to come by, and a lot of suppliers discontinue ingredients. So you don't want to specify too tightly the specific type of ingredient. If it's like a pigment, you may want to specify it by the CAS number so that the compounder has a little bit of latitude to exchange that same ingredient and still fall within the same category. Of course, the resins itself, You want to tightly specify that resin, but not so tightly that you're specifying a certain viscosity that the resin supplier only makes like, once every other year. So having a specification that is too tight on certain things could limit your ability to get product.
Determined and regulatory compliance. How do you deal with all that in terms of what kind of time frame are we talking about? It's a range. I know it depends on.
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting from scratch, we try and keep hundreds, if not 1,000 ingredients in stock so that we can do formulation iterations very quickly, sometimes within days, if not a week, and then getting the samples out to the customer so that they can mold or extrude, even if it's in a prototype fashion, very quickly. Because every time you add another day or week to the cycle, it just keeps growing. So we'll try and keep that process pretty fast, and it could be like 3 to 6 months by the time you really narrow down a formulation and a product. The reason you want to try and keep that development time as quick as possible, because what's out of our control, that's the only thing we have in our control is what we do and the customer. What's out of the control is once it starts going through the regulatory pathway.
So that's 3 to 6 months doesn't include the regulatory
No,
approval?
absolutely not.
So how many more months do you have to add for that?
If it's a 510K, maybe it's another 3 to 6
So it's about a
months,
year.
But if it's a PMA, it could take years.
Any other comments from the panelists?
Well, I disagree. I agree 100% that once you get a formulation, you still got, on average, 3 to 6 months just to get through regulatory requirements.
And I just want to add too that, working with compounders, or material suppliers with an extensive compounding portfolio too, they may have off-the-shelf compounds that are already formulated that could cut down the lead time of having something formulated specifically for your application.
Just one last thing on that. Yes, Larry's correct. If you're going to get a full regulatory approved material in a brand new compound, yes, it might take a year or more. But if you're looking for something simpler, so you want to have talc added to polypropylene, okay, that's relatively fast. Or if you just want to change the color of the material, now you could be 3 or 4 weeks to get a special color made up. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you very much. We have probably time for 1 or 2 more
just
slides.
one more
Sure, go ahead.
quick comment on that. It's very dependent on where it's going. If it's outside the body, very, very quickly. If it's inside the body, less than 7 days, you've got a little more of a regulatory pathway. If it's going to be in greater than 7 days to 30 days, the steps get a little greater. Above 30 days, that puts you in a different category, permanent implant, and that's where the time comes in.
Next question I have pertains to accelerated testing. I've heard a lot of conflicting comments about accelerated testing in terms of the validity of it. So what recommendations do you have for performing accelerated testing for long-term performance, especially parameters such as creep, fatigue? These are things that haunt you later on when you have thousands of products in the field. Environmental stress cracking, or even abrasion resistance. These are all long-term, modes of failure or abuse of a product. I'll start off with Ed.
It's a big question, and we could spend hours on it. I will very quickly say there are some applications you can get a pretty decent idea with, like DMA analysis for creep resistance. So basically you can project out 2 or 3 years based on the DMA analysis, whether or not the material will creep. You can also do things like thermal testing, where you're elevating the temperature to try and see whether or not the product is going to fail in time. You certainly can do physical testing, like if you're dealing with a living hinge. So you set up a fixture that is going to basically just push the part into the function that you're going to apply in real life to try and simulate what it's going to do in the application. But it's a very difficult It's a very difficult question.
Is the data that's actually extracted from accelerated testing, in your opinion, valid? Or I've talked to some people and I find it they don't really.
I would say it's like looking at a data sheet. A data sheet is a representation of a test done on the material under specific conditions and specific temperatures. As soon as you change the variables on the application, the data sheet is only relative to the testing that was done on it. So the same thing is due on long-term testing. So you do a long-term testing, you do a UV analysis, and you put it in a carbon arc device, and you put it in for 2,000 hours. Does it represent what would happen on an outdoor exposure? No. But does it represent something similar that you can use as a gauge? Yes. So you'll get a very good idea whether or not it's going to pass. The actual test is to put the part in real time, real application, real loaded situations under real temperatures. But we don't have the capability of doing that, so we have to get as good of data we can from the testing that we can do to try and simulate what you're going to expect in your product.
Any other comments?
It's going to open up a Pandora's box, but typically, yes, most people, like resin suppliers, will have some of that data that they can share, typically where they've taken molded samples of that same plastic you're interested in and exposed it at elevated temperatures for a different time. And what you'll do is you'll measure a change in a physical property, such as tensile yield, for example. Most plastics, especially on the amorphous glassy side, like polycarbonate or the polyesters that we make, you don't see changes things so much in modulus, but you'll see a tensile yield change, which is based on densification. Basically, the molecules are getting closer together, and so the tensile yield strength will change, it'll go up. This happens in real time if you go over a long enough period of time. So you can definitely do accelerated aging and see data changes there that do tend to line up fairly close to extrapolate. The issue is when you look at standard accelerated aging tests, everything was done based on a packaging, like a medical device package, and picked a value of Q10 Arrhenius equation based on Q10 factor of 2. Well, that's to kind of cover everything. But if you want to know the real value that's for each plastic, you need to go back to the company itself. You can definitely age plastics under that one standardized test, but most of the cases, including whether it's polycarbonate or polyester, you're actually over-aging the plastic beyond what you think the life of the product's going to be. So I think it's important to talk to the material suppliers and ask what kind of data they have, and let them kind of at least teach you what that is, and then you can make your own decision whether or not that's realistic or not.
Thank you.
I think Ken and Ed brought up good points, and I think it's important too to remember what Ed mentioned is that that data set is only going to give you kind of a snapshot of the bigger picture, and nothing's going to substitute part testing to determine the variables that are going to impact it, whether it's processing is going to have an impact, assembly, other parts in that application. And then working with the material supplier and collaborating with them to see what data to get you as close as you're going to get before cutting that production tool with whatever material you chose. I think that's critical.
Thank you. I think.
Just one more comment.
Go ahead.
This is it's not really part aging, but related to aging, and maybe this is just unique to our customer base. But we'll have a customer that pulls out a box of material from 5 years ago and puts it in the molding machine and says, this material's not working the way I remember it 5 years ago. So we get concerned with the storage conditions, and sometimes we'll do an aging study of how long after you compound the material, or if it's an off-the-shelf material, how long could it stay before the properties might change. And usually it's a molding property or the processing change, if it's extrusion. Things that typically absorb moisture, like polyurethanes and some elastomers, some polycarbonates and so forth, I don't know if there's, I hate to use the term shelf life. We hate that term shelf life, but usually a recommended storage conditions and use life of that material before the material's too old, throw it out, get some new material.
Thank you, Larry. I think we have about 15 minutes, is that correct, Laurie? I'd like to open up some questions to the attendees here, or maybe you might want to ask these experts some specific questions.
Questions? Who's got a question?
All right. I've worked with resin suppliers in the past. My company, we do R&D and engineering in New York, and we do a lot of molding overseas. And even when I've worked with companies that have global operations, once we've selected something that's appropriate, and it's like, well, can I get this in China? And the answer is always no. So when I need like special requirements, do you guys have any recommendations on how to partner with one of you, but also get the material where I need it?
I love that question. One of the first 100 questions to ask is, where are you going to mold it? Where are you going to mold it short term, and where are you going to mold it long term? Or are you going to be doing it in multiple locations? We're a global supplier, and yet when somebody gives us that statement, that'll change, a lot of times, it'll change the resin grade. Within the last 2 weeks, somebody was going to mold a part. They were planning on molding it in the United States. At the last moment, they decided to go to Spain. We do have applications in Spain, we do have distribution in Spain, but the material that we recommended for the final application changed at the last moment to an equivalent grade from a different supplier in Spain that was going to be readily available and within the price range that they were looking for. Extremely important to know that. Now, the other question you had was, there are grades that are available in multiple continents. So if there is an opportunity, sometimes it's more expensive, but you can get those grades that can be used in multiple locations. You have to be careful though. It's very, very, very pertinent question in today's environment.
My answer to that would be sure you communicate that as clearly and precisely up front when you're talking to that particular representative, because they may manufacture it in a region of the world that's not where you're planning on molding it. And if that's the case, they need to have that set up to where they can have it delivered and stored in a warehouse or at a distribution partner or something, so they can have that product when you're ready for your molder to take over. So that's one of those things you got to be sure to be open and be front with when you're talking to resin suppliers. We may be specifying the material here, but it's going to be produced in this region of the world.
I think I have one more. I want to get as many questions in as possible. Maybe you could answer this one. Go ahead, Miss.
First of all, excuse me for my English, I will do my best.
It's very good, don't worry about it.
I would like to know if, after choosing the right plastics for beginning the study of biocompatibility.
I can't hear her.
They can repeat it.
Okay, and if you consider that in vitro cytotoxicity testing is an appropriate test for beginning study biocompatibility from the beginning, after chemical characterization and all of that, on the study of the literature.
I don't think we understand. Maybe you might want to step over here because we can't hear you. It's a little muddled.
She's asking about biocompatibility.
Oh, okay. He's the perfect person to answer that question. Larry. Doesn't matter.
So with respect to biocompatibility, from my perspective with SABIC, we do have healthcare grades that have been biocompatibility pre-assessed to ISO 10993. We look at several parts of that ISO 10993 test. I believe we look at 7 components of the 20-part test, but we do have specific healthcare grades that are covered under a healthcare formulation lock, so nothing is going to change within that formulation. They're made with good manufacturing practices, and they've been biocompatibility pre-assessed.
I agree. Eastman's the same way. We basically have materials that we classify as medical healthcare grades that are through SP Class 6 and ISO 10993 biocompatibility testing. We typically do it after 2 types of sterilization methods, E-beam and ethylene oxide gas again. Gamma and ethylene oxide gas. So that data is readily available from the resins companies, especially if you're working with a project with Eastman or in this case Sabic. I'm sure that they would be willing to share that information. But you can't necessarily, you have to still do your own testing for your 510K submission. You can kind of bundle this data if you want to on the plastic, but what we've done to the plastic is not going to always carry over to the device per se.
Any other questions?
So my question has to do with biological stability for single-use injectable devices. Previously, you go back 10 years, certain plastics were used. There were certain biologicals that the half-life of the biological might be 1 day. New plastics have come out where the half-life of the biological might be 6 months. Some of these one-of-a-kind injectable molecules that pharma sells need to test their biological stability if they're going to put them in a plastic product. So can you comment on that? And then the second part of the question is, if you have a resin that you're making different plastics for the gentleman next to Ed, can these additions add to the biological stability for these injectable molecules that may not be very stable?
Ken, you want to take the first crack at that one?
I'll take the first crack. I guess most of the time the data you're looking for is for leachable and extractable information on a specific type of plastic. And this is based to exposure to a certain kind of drug for a period of time. Most material suppliers have that kind of data and would be willing to interact and discuss that with you, but it would only be through like an NDA. I mean, we're not going to just throw away the farm there. So typically, if you want to know more about new materials that are out there that may be more inert per se, that have lower extractable or leachable substances, then you have to interact with the individual material suppliers to get that information.
Yeah, and maybe if I heard the question, is there anything that you could add to the material to improve that characteristic? And there are some chemistries that could change the surface properties of the material, lubricants, and just something that would change the wettability. So maybe I'm probably going to get this wrong, more of a hydrophobic nature of the surface to change the contact angle. So ingredients would not stick to the surface, and they would just kind of come out of the vial or what have you without really much contact with the plastic material at all.
Any other questions? We have time for one more.
Hi. So another question on the biocompatibility.
Wherever else you want to.
So in dealing with a device that might have kind of low level, surface skin contact, brief periods of time, and I'm concerned about like over specifying a resin. So, it seems like there's probably a vast number of resins out there that you can touch all day long and you're fine, but as soon as you start narrowing down to ones that already have this ISO 10993 certification, it whittles it down, and I'm concerned about over specifying something I don't need. So do I just get it tested myself then, and if I do that, then how do I make sure I have the change controls in place on the manufacturing?
I find that working with many of my medical device OEM customers that oftentimes that those biocompatibility assessed materials are specified because of the formulation lock and the surety of supply and the notification period where if anything had to change, if a raw material was discontinued, you get a notification and a longer period of time to transition. So, if the biocompatibility isn't necessarily a requirement, that formulation lock is really kind of critical, and that notification period I find is very helpful in those types of applications.
Yeah, certainly you don't want to over-specify a material and add a lot of layers of cost, but you do have to think about the unintended usage and the fact that even though it's intended to be used only for 30 seconds on the skin, maybe somebody is going to keep it on all day or all week. You just you need to understand that so you could characterize the risk, and then you can do your own testing to see if it's verifiable.
If you know enough about the application that it's going to have minimal skin contact, for example, then there are limited testing that's normally done under the USP Class 6 and ISO 10993 that will indicate that this material can't pass up to that, but it does open up, there may be other plastics out there. And that's, again, based on each resin company that's out there. They'll know if you got a Class 1 or Class 2 or Class 3 device, they'll know up front which materials to recommend based on what you tell them. So.
Totally different perspective on that is there are also antimicrobial materials out. So if you have an application that you're very concerned about microbe generation that would then transport to the patient, you can put an antimicrobial into the material itself, which will be very effective up to generally 99.9% after 72 hours of exposure. So you could basically decrease the microbe content on the surface of the product. That's, again, that's a different aspect of your question, something to consider.
I want to thank the panelists and for everyone who's attended our panel discussion. And I think that adjourns our session. So thank you very much.
I know some of you may have specific questions you'd like to ask our panelists, and in order for us to get our next panel started, if you all could just step to the back, we would greatly appreciate that. Thank you.